Chapter 12. Dex Peak. It wasn't long after we left that I realized I didn't have the map or the notes from Boren. I must have dropped them during the battle. I related this disappointing news to the other two. "Should we go back?" I asked. Kirill and Bog looked at each other. "How much can you remember?" Kirill asked. I'd rather not return. "I think I can remember most of it," I responded. "Probably enough to go on, but what about the map?" "I think we'll be fine," Kirill answered. I didn't want to say it then, but I didn't think it would do us much good anyway. It was so vague. We agreed to push on. I was glad that I didn't have to navigate my way out of the valley alone, but Kirill and Bog seemed to have no trouble at all. We followed the road for an hour or so and then suddenly turned off. How they knew where to go was beyond me, but as they both turned off the road at the same time, and with no hesitation, I couldn't do anything else but follow them. "This is one of the 3 trails that lead out of the valley," Kirill explained as we walked. 2 of them head up into the Kodesh Mountains, and the 3rd trail leads east. This one will take us north towards Dex Peak." "How long till we get there?" I asked. 6 hours or so to get through the pass, and then another hour to the peak. "How's your foot holding up?" "It's fine," I replied. "Your arm?" "Fine." This is about the extent of our conversations, just the bare minimum of information that needed to be asked or given. Mostly we walked in silence, each of us dealing with the loss of Boren in our own way. Every so often Kirill would curse and voice a threat against Jack. He couldn't wait to face him and make him pay for what happened to Boren. Bog never said a single word. I was concerned for him and a couple of times tried to gently prod some responses out of him, but never received anything more than a grunt. I soon gave it up. As for me, my mind just kept going around and around, trying to envision a scenario in which Jack was stopped and we were victorious. The leader of the Foatin had said, "Leave none alive." Were those Jack's orders? They must have been, and if that was the case, then Jack showed his hand sooner than he wanted. He had no intention of returning me back to my home, and likely no intention of releasing Mother from the spell. The line was drawn in the sand. The stakes couldn't be higher. But how was I supposed to kill my own brother? Killing the giants the previous night was hard enough. I didn't know them, and it all happened in the heat of the battle. But killing someone I knew, my own flesh and blood? And yet wasn't that exactly what Jack was intending? At the end of the day, though, I wasn't Jack. Round and round my argument went until I was exhausted from the subject. I had to concede the fact that I didn't know how I was going to accomplish the terrible goal, and probably wasn't going to until the moment arrived. As the trail climbed steadily upwards, the mist began to thin as though we were surfacing from a deep pool. Sometimes the trail was quite steep, and the switchbacks seemed to stack one on top of the other. Other times it leveled off through meadows and glens resplendent with wild flowers. The rich, sweet scent of the flowers mixed with the mountain air was so invigorating that although my legs were growing exhausted from the increasing elevation, my soul was being refreshed. We stopped for a short break and some food at around midday beside a cold mountain lake. Above and behind the lake rose one of the many peaks that made up the Kodesh Range, its image reflected in the still waters. A small island stood alone in the middle of the lake, all gray and rocky except for a tiny splash of color. The color caught my interest, and as I ate my food I stared at it, trying to discern what it was. A gentle breeze skimmed along the water towards the island, and in a moment I had my answer. It was a single wild mountain flower. Somehow it had found enough soil on that rocky spot to root and grow, and now it stood defiantly displaying its beauty in the midst of otherwise harsh and bare surroundings. I felt strangely buoyed by its tenacity. If it could stand with so much grace, why couldn't I? Rarely do we get the chance to choose our environments, but always we get the chance to choose our character. I looked over again at Bog and Kirill. Bog sat quietly, munching on his lunch and looking up ahead the trail, while Kirill sifted through his pack, rearranging several things to balance the load a bit more. In the short time that I'd known them, they had both revealed the kind of character that I wanted in my life. Courage, commitment, and kindness. What would the coming days hold for them? I determined in that moment to do everything in my power to keep them from suffering a similar fate as their father. Kirill finished his repacking and stood up. "Let's keep going," he said. "We have a couple more hours until we make it through the pass. We'll make camp there so we can take a fresh start to Dex Peak in the morning." Bog and I also arose, and after a quick stretch we commenced our hike. As Kirill predicted, we came through the pass in the next couple of hours. After setting up camp, I walked to a clearing just past a group of trees that stood right next to us. The view stretched out before me. The Kodesh Mountains ran down into vast flatlands below. There were large tracts of arable land tilled in random sections. Here and there tiny castles could be seen. Far away, off to the northwest, there rose another peak. "Wave to Jack," said Kiro, walking up behind me. "What?" I asked. "That's the King's Mountain, about 4 days' walk from here," he replied, pointing to the mountain. "Jack's castle's at the base of it." I stared across the land towards the mountain and tried to comprehend what was going through Jack's mind at that moment. Could he see us as well? Somehow he had found us in the valley. Could he find us again now that we were on the move? Did he even know that his plan had failed? I could only hope that we had the advantage of surprise on our side. Even if he did know of the 3 lost stones, he didn't know where they were and would have to have us to find them. Hopefully, if we kept on the move, we could elude his probing search. We got an early night that night and were up and packed shortly after sunrise. We turned north and continued along the west side of the mountains for the next hour. Since we were targeting a lower elevation, the walk was less strenuous and seemed to go by quickly. Pretty soon we came over a final ridge, and Kirill stopped. "Dex Peak," he declared. Looking ahead, I saw a spire of rock jutting upwards from the side of the mountain. It rose to about 50 feet and was roughly 30 feet in diameter. It stood amongst other peaks of similar formation, although it was by far the largest. "Why is it called Dex Peak?" I asked. It was Bog who answered. "There is a legend that after the giants arrived here in Terrace, Dex never stopped searching for the threshold where he could find Tia again. He sought long and hard, but was never successful. He would often come out of the valley and stand here on the side of the Kodesh Mountains, surveying the land and trying to decipher where the portal of the threshold was. He would stay here longer and longer as he got older. Finally, he simply turned into this pyre of stone where he looks eternally for his long-lost love." "Well," Kirill said, "let's go see if old Deck is holding the magic stones, shall we?" "Wait," warned Bog. "Look." We glanced up to the top of the spire where suddenly there was a movement. An enormous bird, larger than any I had ever seen, stood up on the top of the peak. It spread its wings and let out a tremendous screech. An instant later another huge bird came flying over the adjacent ridge and shot straight for Dex Peak. The first bird vaulted off the peak and met the second head on. There was a terrific struggle as the two battled in midair. I was amazed at the agility of such massive creatures. I was also terrified at the sheer ferocity of their battle. Not letting up for one moment, the two opponents tore and beat and scratched each other. They would fall towards the ground and deathly embrace and then break away at the last minute, each one madly trying to get above the other one. I could not believe that they could fight so long and so viciously without killing each other. Finally, the first bird gained the advantage and the second was driven off. The victor returned to the peak, still squawking and screeching. "What was that all about?" I asked, stunned. "Look again," was Bog's answer. A second massive head rose from the top of the peak. There was another bird up there. The two of them touched their beaks together in a sign of companionship, and it dawned on me that there must be some type of nest up there, and what we witnessed was a territory battle. My heart sank as I realized the challenge that was before us. "Boren hid the stone up there?" I asked. "That's what he said," replied Kirill. "Excellent," I responded. "I'm sure that those birds would have loved nothing more than for me to pay them a little visit. Perhaps they'll sit by me and sing me a little song when I arrive." "The Killikal were never known for their hospitality," said Kirill. "But don't worry, I have a plan." "What plan?" I asked. "Well," Kirill began, "as you may have noticed, the Killikal are tremendously territorial. They will stop at nothing to drive off any trespassers." "Yeah, I sort of had that part figured out." "Bog and I will lure the two of them away while you climb up there and have a look around." I looked at the rock, already trying to map a route up it. "Okay, but what if they come back while I'm up there?" "That is the one flaw in my design," Kirill went on, "but we'll make sure that we keep them occupied. Just don't take too long." "And you might be hidden while you climb," added Bog. "Hidden? How?" "The rock is fashioned like a chimney," Bog went on. "It has a hollow chute rising up the middle of it. There's an opening near the bottom." He pointed to the left side of the spire, and I could see the small dark opening. "Well, why don't you and I sneak over and take a look, see if it's climbable," suggested Kirill. We scurried over to the base of the rock, avoiding detection by the pair of Killikali. There was enough room for the two of us to look into the opening. The wall of rock was about 24 inches thick, and as we stuck our heads in, we were accosted by a terrific stench. "What is that?" I gagged. "Ah, I do believe we have found their outhouse," Kirill responded. Sure enough, at the base of the chute was an immense pile of bird droppings. As we looked up the chute, we could see that the walls were likewise covered in the waste, and the whole thing was a slippery, disgusting mess. We quickly pulled back out of the opening. "There's no way I'm going up in there," I stated emphatically. Kirill only laughed, and we skittered back to where Bog was waiting. After explaining the situation to him, and declaring again that there was no way I was going to scale those walls, we determined that I would have to climb the outside. I surveyed the rock again. There were several cracks and jutted rocks that would make the climb attainable. However, there was one spot near the top that appeared like it was going to be particularly difficult. I wouldn't actually know until I got there, but I was relatively confident that I could overcome the obstacles, and besides, I didn't have an option. Bog and Kirill had already devised their part in the plan. Kirill would attempt to attract and lead off the first Killicow. Once that one was effectively engaged, Bog would try and attempt the other one out. Then, while they were preoccupied, I would climb to the top and search for the stone. It sounded so simple in the planning, but somehow I doubted it would be as simple in execution. Consequently, I was quite surprised when their parts went off so effectively. Kirill began by throwing some stones towards the area and yelling at the top of his lungs. Still somewhat aggravated by the recent attack, the Killicow was more than ready to engage Kirill's advances. It was up and over the ledge and swooping down on Kirill so fast that I didn't think Kirill would get away. But he was ready, and like a bolt of lightning he was off, back the way we came, taking shelter amongst the trees and rocky crags and continually harassing the large predator. Bog's approach was slightly different. Once Kirill was out of sight, Bog picked up a large branch that he found lying in the underbrush and began pounding on the backside of the rock, bellowing out his challenges. Although huge and dangerous as far as physicality was concerned, the Killically weren't the most intelligent of beasts. It should have been obvious to the remaining bird that Bog wasn't climbing or posing any threat to its immediate vicinity, but the challenge seemed to be enough to lure it from its abode. It dropped from the peak like a stone and landed between Bog and the rock. It was even larger than the first one. Its razor-sharp beak lunged continuously at Bog, who countered with the log in a kind of deadly sword fight. With its fierce eyes fixed on Bog and its back to me, I was free to attempt my climb. Without any hesitation, I began to ascend the spire. The first 30 feet were easily transcended, as there were footholds and ledges aplenty. The final 20 were more challenging. Several times my options were reduced to tiny cracks in the rock just big enough for me to jam my fingers into. At last I reached the spot that looked so difficult from the ground, and to my dismay, my earlier observations proved accurate. There was a span of clean, flat rock about 6 feet across. It was too wide for me to reach the handhold that I could see on the other side of the face. I would have to leap for it. At 45 feet up the rock, my heart was beating rapidly at the prospect of what I was intending to do. I took several deep breaths and stared at the handhold, gauging and then re-gauging the distance. I had a little ledge that I was standing on, and I shifted my toes to make certain that my launching pad was firm. Finally, after one more deep breath, I hurled my body up and off of the ledge that I had been on. I caught the target hold on the other side of the face, but was moving at such a momentum that my left hand slipped off. My body swung uncontrollably as I hung on with the fingers of my right hand, and I twisted around so that I was facing away from the rock. I clenched my eyes shut and focused only on holding my grip. Looking down would do me no good. For a moment I hung there in space, but then I stabilized against the rock wall and with a pointed effort swung back around and grabbed the hold with my left hand as well. The remaining 5 feet were relatively simple, and before I knew it, I was up and over the top rim of the spire. The first thing I noticed as I rubbed my hands together and caught my breath was the immense nest that filled most of the top of the peak. It must have been 20 feet wide. It was made of feathers and mud, grasses and branches. Some of the branches were as wide as my wrists. In the center of the nest were 4 immense eggs, each one bigger than my head. They were the color of sand and had many dark blue smudges on them. No wonder those birds were so territorial, I thought, and glanced quickly over the edge to see that Bog was still in battle with the second Killicow. They had moved farther down the way, and although Bog was looking winded, he was still an effective match for the huge bird. I looked the other way, to where Kirill had led off the first Killicow. They were nowhere to be seen. While that gave me confidence, I knew I still needed to search as quickly as possible. What was I looking for, though, I wondered? Would the stone be left just lying around? What if the birds had moved it or used it to build their nest? What if they mistook it for some kind of seed and ate it? I did not want to sift through whatever was at the bottom of the chute. These thoughts filled my mind as I quickly and carefully searched around the top of the peak. My initial investigation proved fruitless, and so I started over again, this time more desperately. Every minute that I was unsuccessful on top of the peak was another minute that Bog and Kirill had to keep the Killically occupied. I was as thorough as I could be under the constrictions of haste imposed upon me, but after my second attempt there was still no stone. Frantic now, I was about to commence my third scouring of the area when I heard the terrifying sound of something massive landing behind me. I swung around and came face to face with the Killical. It was battered and bloody and angry, and I knew in a moment that it was the third creature that had been driven off earlier. It had obviously decided to make another attempt at the nest, and with the 2 residents gone and only one small human to contend with, it appeared as though its gamble was going to pay off.